Greg.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, thanks for joining me. Today, we're going to discuss the foundational concepts of operational resilience. And, this is a topic I feel very, very passionately about, and you do as well. And I feel it's one of those topics where the relevance and timeliness of this topic just demonstrates itself more and more every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And you just see things like Fenestra and what happened with 45 of the top 50 financial institutions in the country, and we're still rolling on the back of the CrowdStrike software issue, and there's just a lot from an operational resilience perspective that this space has, and that will continue to have over the next decades.
Well, Greg, I think the CrowdStrike situation demonstrates that the need to master the fundamentals in cybersecurity as the building blocks for operational resilience haven't really changed. The technology stack changes, but the topics we're discussing today are really enduring.
Oh, by all means. And I think from the CrowdStrike situation, operational resilience professionals can never let a incident go to waste. And that's a software development issue that created a global outage. And we have so many things to learn from that. And by applying those learnings in organizations across the globe, I think we can look to prevent those types of things from occurring again.
Yeah, agree, Greg. And today we hope to leave the audience not only with an understanding of the fundamentals of operational resilience, but also next steps and tangible actions they can take to improve their operational resilience.
Yeah, but by all means, we're throwing around this term resilience, and we often hear it thrown around, and sometimes it's misunderstood. How do you define operational resilience in the context of today's evolving cyber landscape?
Sure, Greg. So let me give you sort of a canonical definition of operational resilience, and then maybe a more applied version of it. So in physics, resilience is the attribute or the property of a material's ability to withstand some deformative event and go back into its intended shape. And for the audience, let me give you a description. Greg and I are both old enough to have had metal slinkies when we were kids, I believe. So if you had a metal slinky and like I did, and you did what I did, which is I took one end and my brother took the other, and we pulled on the slinky as hard as we could, it was no longer a slinky, it was a bent piece of wire, right? And to me, that is a very visceral depiction of operational resilience. We want organizations to flex and pivot based on conditions, but come back to their intended operating shape and condition. Let's say a more sophisticated description would be the understanding that organizations have to anticipate two obligations. One is defending as best as possible, and then other is sustaining as best as possible. But we are not going to be free from cyber events and disruptive cyber events, right? It would be a fool's errand to believe we could build the walls high enough in cybersecurity to mitigate all risk. So what I'm really saying, Greg, is that organizations must think about, manage, plan, and exhibit diligence in managing the conditions that the organization is subject to in cyberspace, and also managing the consequences of exploitation in cyberspace.
Yeah, as you're kind of walking through those fundamentals and making me think, really business outcomes are really important relative to this. And we saw the business impacts of the CrowdStrike incident. And, we see so many business impacts of ransomware attacks, for example. Why is operational resilience more critical now than ever before, especially in the current threat landscape?
I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is I think the growing admission that we're not going to stop things that are disruptive, and those can be large and systematic and systemic, or they can be small and localized. But at the end of the day, if your business, and we'll talk more about mission and assets, if the things you do as an organization are impaired, you must have a valid plan to respond to that incident and then recover from it, right? So I would describe it as operational resilience is at its core the quest for survivability in very uncertain times. Now, it's kind of cliche to say there's more threats than ever, but I would argue recent history has taught us no matter how many defenses you layer in, something is going to create a disruption at some point in your organizational life cycle.
Yeah, fascinating. As we look at the current landscape, organizations from a resilience perspective are really trying to figure out AI, for example. And it's not necessarily as much a security risk as it is a business risk for the organization. And how are you making yourself resilient to your competitors that are going to be using that technology to get you out of the market? And just thinking about how to apply these principles in a way that helps organizations understand the business operational and security impacts, I think, are important. Can you walk us through some of these core principles of the CERT Resilience Management Model and how they apply to managing operational risk?
Yeah, certainly, Greg. So let me maybe explain what the CERT Resilience Management Model is. Now, it's something you're well familiar with, and you've been a key partner over the years in developing and applying the model. So the CERT Resilience Management Model is a capability maturity model developed here in the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute in the early 2000s based on a request from the financial services industry. Financial services industry said, well, we really like the work you've done in software engineering. We're taking these fundamental practices and principles related to measuring the quality of outcome, right, in a predictive way. So for our audience members that are familiar with the software CMM, we took those concepts and applied it to the topic of operational resilience. So we constructed a model, we scoured the earth and looked at every standard of practice you can imagine, and then called that down so we saw as the most essential practices. And that gave us 26 process areas. So these are affinity match groups of practices. Now, what makes this different from, let's say, a checklist or, let's say, a NIST special publication is that in addition to the do or do not do checklist questions, let's call it the capability component, we have the maturity component, right? So we're going to measure attributes of the way you do those things, right? And you may ask, why do this? And I know, Greg, one of the reasons you're an advocate, as I am, is that this is more predictive than a simple checklist. So, sort of put simply, right, the model was born out of a desire by the financial services industry and other partners to have a more robust way to predict future outcomes in contested cyberspace is maybe the better way to put it. So the model exists in its raw form. There's now many derivatives of that model that are out in the wild. You asked about the kind of the key principles. Principle one, this is a capability maturity model. And institutionalization of practice and process is important. We know this from software engineering. So the stickiness of a process or practice will oftentimes determine success or failure. For instance, let's imagine that the topic is incident management. And the organization has given Matt and Greg responsibility for incident management. But we don't bother to write anything down. We don't bother to rehearse anything. We never test these plans. We don't have any way to measure if we're doing good, bad, or indifferent. And the knowledge is only in our heads. Now, we would call that a fragile process. That would be very low on our maturity scale. Those fragile processes are the first to fall over dead in a time of organizational stress. And we know this not just in a theoretical sense, but from our own life experience. I know it was a bit of a ramble, but as you can see, I feel strongly that organizations need to consider operational resilience as being synonymous with survivability in contested cyberspace.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack, obviously. And the 26 process areas are so dense from a capability perspective. I have had the opportunity of working around the model for a couple of nearly 2 decades now. And from my real world experience, I think that by by incorporating those process areas and aligning them with your business objectives from an organizational perspective, you can really support your organization. And I had the good occasion in 2008 to start to work with the model, and we learned significantly as a law enforcement officer in the post office about the impacts of white powder substances in the mail. And it was a real eye opener. And I use this as a metaphor. And I think metaphors are so important in this space because we just learn from incidents. And right after 9/11, there were a couple of envelopes that were sent that had anthrax in them. And in the October 2001 timeframe, unfortunately, we had a couple of postal employees that passed away from inhalation of weaponized anthrax, and it sent our employee base literally running from white powders in the post offices. And in the processing of mail, there's so many different substances that employees will come in contact with. For example, and who knew that the magazine industry and the publication industry uses cornstarch to separate magazines in processing. Well, excess cornstarch ends up as a white powder in a post office on a belt. And so we learned firsthand kind of the value of operational resilience in being able to respond to those kinds of incidents. At the time, we would have postal employees who would find a white powder, and our protocol was, if you saw the white powder, evacuate the facility, call in the hazmat unit, have them test the substance, and then you can get back to operations once the hazmat unit has determined an all clear. Well, from sugar to cornstarch and everything in between, we had postal facilities being evacuated left and right for what was clearly not anthrax. And we were getting first responders coming in with their hazmat suits, and our employees very concerned about these. And you can only imagine the impacts of a large processing facility evacuating in order to be able to do these activities. So really slowing down mail processing operations from a business impact perspective, impacting our employees, impacting and wasting the time of hazmat units and first responders. Applying the principles of operational resilience, we trained a set of law enforcement officers, 400 across the United States, that became our first line responders to these incidents. And by training our personnel and being able to manage those incidents in a more structured, concrete way, we were able to prevent facilities from being evacuated, the mail processing slowdowns, the employee impacts, and the law enforcement response impacts, and keeping our operations up and running. We were actually able to show a strong economic benefit of the wasted labor hours, the fees that we'd have to pay to first responders to come. You can only imagine the costs that we were encumbering. And so there was a real financial benefit to these operational resilience activities that we made. And so when I look at what happened with CrowdStrike and, for example, Delta's inability to move people on airplanes, it's literally the same thing. and by understanding how you can apply this model to the operational context of technology is so critical for us as practitioners to be able to keep our operations up and running in a time of stress so that we have great customer experiences, keep our businesses operating, and save significant amounts of cost. So, that's why I love the CERT Resilience Management Model. And, I just pointed to it, but, a key focus of CERT RMM is this asset and dependency management.
Yeah, certainly, Greg.
Yeah, could you elaborate on
Yeah,
that?
thank you for describing the incident you faced while with the Postal Service, because I think it does illustrate several things that we should explain for the audience, right? So you were describing an incident that didn't originate in cyber, but had impacts across the organization. It's kind of the first thing to understand in operational resilience kind of fundamentals, which is we don't view the things organizations do as loose associations, right? In the case of the Postal Service, sorting and distributing mail or packages, or mail package handling, would what we call a critical service, right? So, and organizations are made up of these critical services, right? In the case of an airline, there's ticketing, and then there's flight operations and baggage handling, and on and on and on. Well, all of those discrete services are underpinned by assets. Now, often those assets are shared, but one of the things I think that makes our worldview a little unique, and you saw this in your postal example, is that we're not addressing just the technology asset, but rather the interplay of 4 asset types: technology, information, facilities, people, right? So I think one of the key things I'd like to explain in this description of assets and services and dependencies is that we have what I would describe as an expansive worldview, that all 4 of these asset types come with their own requirements, and we have to think through the secure and resilient operation of these assets. So if you think about it, in the case of the Postal Service, the threat actor introducing a white powdery substance, or a white powdery substance being interpreted as that threat, disrupted not just one service, but multiple critical services, because your facility and people assets were impaired. That's one to many element of operational resilience that the audience should understand, right? That by impairing a single asset, you can then knock down multiple services in most organizations.
Yeah, that's so critical. And I was on a call with a cross collaborative group of military and civilian agencies talking about DevSecOps literally yesterday. And one of the military participants talked about the importance of supporting battlefield operations. And we were talking about coming up with a charter for a DevSecOps working group that we're part of. And we talked about critical government functions. And, there were some business leaders on the phone and said, hey, critical government functions, battlefield operations, I'm concerned about my business. How do we bring that all together? And, what are some best practices for organizations when we need to think about how to inventory and manage high value assets effectively?
Yeah, great. It's an excellent question. And I think I really like the way you describe that whether you're in a military context, of course, here at the SCI, we're sponsored by the DoD, so we think about that first and foremost, or you're a federal agency, or you're in private industry. I would argue the way you approach this challenge is more similar than dissimilar. So you will operate assets across those 4 types: technology, information, people, and facilities, in some combination to support the service and then support the mission. Something we should also mention, Greg, and I think this is certainly one of the things we've seen modify the role of the CISO and the Director of Cybersecurity in organizations, is that now more than ever, the obligation to protect and sustain these assets might not be directly in your own control. It might be a cloud service provider. It might be a managed security service provider. It might be some partner organization. So another point I'd make is that operational resilience is inextricably tied to supply chain risk management. And that supply chain, those partners are an extension of you. So from a resilience perspective, all the things we're discussing now, the audience, I believe, should be asking those questions of their partners. But maybe to answer your question more succinctly.
No, I think you're bringing up
Okay.
super points. I mean, Fenestra was yesterday's event in the news. Earlier this year we had the snowflake incident from a supply chain perspective. I think we all need to learn from what happened with the automobile distributors and dealerships across the country with the CDK Global ransomware attack. How should organizations rethink their approach to resilience in light of these kinds of attacks?
Yeah, that's an excellent. And this is, again, arming the audience with some practical suggestions. Step one, understand the assets you operate. Right. So let me make this pitch, Greg, and I think you and I live this in partnership. Yes, this can be very sophisticated, but it really can just start with a dry erase board, right? Which is, here are the critical things we do. Here are the assets across those 4 categories that support it. Here are the linkages between those things. Now, you must pivot to thinking about that obligation, right? Protecting and sustaining. And organizations are making security choices either consciously and deliberately or simply by avoiding the question, right? But at the end of the day, you've selected some course of action. I would suggest, Greg, that organizations need to think deliberately about that balance, right? Don't over-index on protective measures, right? And don't underemphasize recovery and sustainment capabilities, right? It's striking that balance. You might say, well, how do we determine what's best for us? Now, there's tools to do that here at CERT, and certainly, Greg, I know you have thoughts on that as well. But fundamentally, that need, that balance, is going to come down to your organization's mission, your risk appetite, and your risk tolerance. And I think you'd agree, Greg, if you do this right, and I want to talk to you a little bit about metrics a little later, you can actually find efficiency. In my experience, I find some organizations are sort of wistfully over-indexing on defensive capabilities, just assuming the bad thing will never happen and neglecting recovery. Or others are focused on recovering assets that aren't so critical and maybe really not optimizing the spend they have on those sustainment recovery capabilities. You manage a very large enterprise while you were in government service. And I'm sure that the challenges you have were manifold, right? You have many, many services, many, many assets. But I believe no matter if you're a medium market organization or one of the largest federal or federally adjacent enterprises in the world, the fundamental questions kind of remain the same. And that's, I think, the elegance of applying an operational resilience mindset instead of capabilities.
Yeah, really great points, Matt. And I think I've so many times have early in engagements outside of my government employment and in the post office sat down and said, what are the services that we deliver? What are the assets that are necessary? What are the levels of impact that will have a measurable are measurable for this particular situation? Like, how many employees are impacted by a particular incident? What operations from a service perspective, do we need to be concerned about? And, that interplay between kind of resilience requirements and risk are so important because that's how risk should be measured is the business impacts. And doing that early in the process. And I've had the opportunity to do it in government agencies, in financial services, in small clear defense contractors, and even in startups. I work with startups today, and we're looking at, it's all about how do we get to those metrics of performance that support our customers.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I was going to ask that question. So this, on first glance, these concepts might seem a bit ethereal. and difficult to translate into a message for senior leadership. So I know in your career, like my career, we've faced different structures, but at the end of the day, we're always needing to impart succinctly and compellingly some message about operational resilience to it could be a board of directors, it could be military personnel, it could be a board of governors. Thoughts about how best to describe the benefit of operational resilience to a senior audience like those?
There's several different lenses that I believe are necessary in order to be able to educate senior audience relative to the benefits of resilience. And those are tied closely to risk. And understanding where the organization is at from a maturity perspective in their risk discussions is an important place to meet the leadership team. And do they understand and do they measure to service performance for the products that they are delivering to the marketplace? Is that what they're most concerned about? When you understand that that's what their biggest concern is, then you can index your risk management discussions to those conversations, whether it's the number of financial transactions or the number of customers that you're supporting, and the business impacts of downtime that relate to those customers. I've got so many different examples to share, Matt, and I'll use an example out of financial services. And I had the good occasion to work in a financial services organization, and we had an API related issue. I was testing all of the APIs for the organization, and we found an exposure that could leak customer information. Now, by being able to articulate the number and range of impact of customers that can be impacted through that type of API exposure, you can go to the board and say, okay, here's the number of customers that will be impacted. This is the downtime that we're going to have to take to properly manage this vulnerability. These are the costs that are going to be associated with that. And on the opposite side, these are the costs that will be avoided by taking those actions in order to be able to address the risk that exists. And so I think those are very important as we think about how to articulate risk to the executive leadership team. And you need to know your executive leaders and what they're concerned about. Employee issues, your Chief Human Resources Officer is your best friend. Legal issues, General Counsel is your partner. And the most important organizational component typically is the COO for an organization, and your ability to move the operations of the organization in collaboration with the metrics that are important to them only gives you that much stronger of a business case for all of the operational resilience activities that you want to make across the company.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, for sharing that. I mean, a couple of things stand out in my mind that no matter what endeavor, what line of business you're in, with some exceptions, I suppose, most of us are making monetized decisions. And that's, I think, really important for cyber leaders to understand that, for years, practitioners like us said we needed a seat at the table in the boardroom, right? And we got it in the form of the CISO. And well, if you're going to have a seat at the table, then you need to be able to express your value and the risk that you see in a way that's comparable with others in the room. So I think what you described is really important. The other point I draw on is that predictability is always a good thing, right? No one wants uncertainty in the government, the military, or business. So the more predictive and uncertainty reducing we can be, and the application of operations, the better off we are. So we're not doing these things just to edify cybersecurity practitioners. We're doing these things to make organizations more survivable, predictable, and ultimately more profitable. There's actually good research by McKinsey and others to say the market rewards you for being resilient. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Greg, but certainly if I were going to plunk down money on a company, and maybe in the startup sense, an organization that could demonstrate they can protect and sustain the things that are really important would win over someone that can't explain to me the assets they operate and how they're going to do those two things.
Yeah, ask, we let in with the CrowdStrike situation. Ask Delta's customers how they feel about Delta's service through that situation. And I think that goes to the heart of what you just shared, Matt, is organizations that are able to sustain their technology assets, for example, to move their operations, are going to benefit in the marketplace by being able to do that. One thing that you brought up, and I see this time and time again, we've got this seat in front of the leadership team and the board, and too often we're making the conversation about where we are at against NIST-CSF. We're making the resilience view a periodic check rather than a continuous process. How do you recommend integrating resilience practices into daily operations? And then I'll give a couple of my thoughts on that too.
Yeah, great. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Greg. So here's where I believe organizations should start their journey. So when we reference things in the NIST, CSF, or ISO, I know we don't mean it in a disparaging way, but rather it's necessary but insufficient. I believe using RMM, right? I know that it's going to give you dimensions of measurement not capable just using 853, right? So an organization needs to snap that chalk line and say, here's where we are now, and then use these tools in the form of assessments. And right, maybe in a future discussion, we could talk about some of the derivatives and lighter weight ways to measure yourself. But once you say, here's where we are, here's where we need to be, I would suggest then these resilience practices have to be deliberately baked into the way the organization works. We call that institutionalization of practice, inculcation, lots of kind of high-minded terms. What it really means is you can do things in a repeatable and reliable way, right? So from my perspective, measuring where you are, determining where you want to go, and that can be even fairly unsophisticated, and then having a way to periodically check. So for instance, Greg, let's give the audience an example. Let's say that you want to lose weight. Well, okay, to know if you've lost weight, you need to know what your weight is. And then every day you've got to say, well, okay, I'm going to weigh myself, but what are those activities I'm going to introduce that allow me to meet my goal? And I think it's similar. Maybe that's a too simplistic example, but in both cases, if you don't make it part of the way you live or the way you work, you're likely not making real strides. So I'd say, as maybe cliched as it sounds, we want the organization to think first about resilience, which is if we're going to introduce new tech, if we're going to bring on a new partner, what does that mean to our operational resilience and our survivability? And back that up with metrics. A word about metrics, and I think you'd agree, Greg. You can get lost in a thicket of metrics. I would argue that organizations contemplating operational resilience should start small with metrics and then grow into the superset of metrics. So let me stop there for your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah, I think a lot of good stuff there. I want to pick up on the institutionalization of processes, and NIST-CSF is not a maturity model.
Correct.
And there are organizations out there that sell it as a maturity model. And I dare any organization that's selling it as a maturity model to show the specific steps to institutionalize NIST-CSF, because they do not exist, and it shouldn't be sold that way.
Absolutely agree, Greg. It's either a lack of understanding or a conscious attempt to sell something that really isn't that something. So I'm with you 100%. And we need to be good consumers of these things, don't we, Greg? That there's a lot of things that sound like operational resilience or frameworks that do that and models, but they're not all what they say they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to those core institutionalization of process, uh, you know, for your processes in your organization, do you have people that are assigned to do those tasks? Are they trained? Do they have processes? Do they have the tools? Are they properly funded? Uh, are the policies in place in order to be able to see how those components integrate in, those processes integrate in with the other important organizational outcomes that need to be made by the company or entity? That's institutionalization. And by being able to measure your performance against those, sometimes I refer to them as management practices.
Which that's exactly what it's a great term. Yeah.
And, I think that's what really gets your organization into assuring that you're continuously doing these activities in your daily operations.
Yeah. I think it's so important, which is, I started this webcast talking about the emergent property of resilience, right? Well, I mean, let's draw on the health example or the weight loss example. You can't go to the doctor and then get a diagnosis that you're healthy forever. At that point in time, you're healthy, but there have to be measures. There have to be ways to verify that. So, look at it that way. You need to make this part of the organizational DNA, which is a hackneyed phrase, but I think absolutely appropriate. And you've got to then ask yourself, are we deriving the value that we thought from the program? So I'm a big believer in having an iterative process here, right? The Deming cycle is at the heart of many things at CMU, right? How do you know that you've made the right changes, and how do you tune that? Because at the end of the day, Greg and Matt, and not to speak for both of us, Greg, we're not advocating for spending untold fortunes on resilience. What we're saying is make the right investment that's fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think that really gets to the leadership challenge,
Yeah.
right? Um, and the leader making those trade-off decisions relative to prioritization of resource allocation, and where do we really need the focus in order to be able to uh, assure the organization is going to be able to respond to the stresses that have been demonstrated or have been demonstrated in other organizations, and are preventative in nature in their own. What do you believe to be kind of that leadership play in driving resilience efforts?
Yeah, well, I think it's first an acknowledgement that an organization would rather be good than lucky, right? So as you mentioned, right, just because you haven't experienced that scenario of cyber disruption or operational resilience being impaired by some event doesn't mean you won't, right? And on a long enough timeline, we're all subject to it. I think Chuck Palahniuk said that, right? But I think it's really important to just admit that you're going to have incidents, which actually is more difficult than I first thought for some CISOs and CIOs, right? Which is from a leadership challenge perspective, Greg, having the maturity in the organization to realize the reaction to an event isn't firing the CISO or CIO, but rather explaining the things you can do differently next time. And that's not to say that you should capriciously run the organization and just hope for the best. What I'm really saying is be good at the things that will make you survive, and then ensure the investment follows. So, like most things in organizations, tone at the top really matters, and you will be competing for finite resources, right? You mentioned AI. I think this is a key example where when that LLM project is competing for resources for something else in IT security, we have to think through the trade-offs there, right? So the condition, the technology stack will change, the set of threat actors will change, the attack surface will change, but I firmly believe that these principles, and they're engineering principles, as you said, business processes, practices, rooted in measurement, will see us through in uncertain times.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, Matt. And from what I'm seeing, I want to go off on two angles. The first is leadership and what we've seen over the last couple of years relative to cyber. And then the second is AI. And this first relative to leadership, obviously, there's a lot of conversation as to who is the principal officer that should be held responsible for an organization's lack of security preparedness and operational resilience. And I think that it's extremely important to consider those perspectives for an organization, because the CEO is responsible for the business operations of the organization. And that, I think, really speaks to their responsibility to have resilient practices to make sure that the organization can perform in spite of a security incident. Now, the role of the security practitioner is as critically as important as well. And security practitioners can't point the finger at the leadership team because unless they have communicated their situation and risks properly. And we've got a lot of security practitioners in the field, unfortunately, that can't have that conversation with their leadership teams in the way that is open and transparent, and it puts them in a bad position. And I think we talk about stress and burnout and the challenge of cyber, and well, quite frankly, I think that's one of the most significant contributors to that issue is organizational culture is not allowing for that open, transparent security view. Now, we have a great example with AI. NVIDIA comes out with earnings just the other day, 97% increase in sales. Oh my goodness. Okay. Technology driver driving basically the platformization of AI across every organization. AI SecOps being a fundamental requirement now for every organization. Where are the security practitioners? The conversations that I have the good fortune of being with a venture capital firm that has 4 AI security related investments. And we're trying to have the conversations with the security practitioners relative to their AI SecOps discussions. They're all pointing most practitioners in the security field are saying, hey, that's not me. I don't understand that. I don't have a control set to deal with that. Talk to my chief AI officer, talk to the CTO, talk to the CIO, and we're in trouble.
Yeah. Greg, if I just react to that, I think we've seen this movie before, right? So as new tech is introduced, and AI is arguably more transparent, transformative, and more there's more potential impact. However, again, the fundamentals apply, right? There's something you're doing. If you're using AI to do that something, you're still using the same construct of assets associated with an activity, right? So I'm really glad you brought this up. I think I do see lots of cybersecurity practitioners that seem a bit lost because AI is the topic. Now more than ever, draw on the first principles we know that are the most important. So in 5 years or 7 years, if we do this again, right, and I hope we do this discussion, we will be talking about quantum in the same way. So let's selecting and using a capable maturity model like CERT RMM, I think gives you a North Star, even when these factors like this technology stack or the threat actors change. So let's play this move in the other direction. Let's assume now we're subject to synthetic adversaries and we need to counter AI. We barely have enough people in society to build AI, let alone think about how to defend it, right? So in CERTs, we've stood up an AI CERT here within the SCI, which is great, but we need to expand that and teach others. But again, keep your wits about you, right? The board should, cybersecurity practitioners should, right? And just society in general, right? Let's not overreact to new tech. Let's apply these engineering concepts we know work and ensure reliable, resilient AI working and enveloped by a resilient enterprise.
Yeah, you're making so many good points, and we'll have to do just an episode on AI SecOps, AI resilience.
Absolutely love to.
Clearly, the tool sets that are being used in AI development are different. Uh, the hardware and the energy usage and all of those issues that relate to sustainable AI are a fascinating topic and one that's well worthy of our situation here. And that's the passion of why I wanted to collaborate with you on this series, is because resilience stays the key focus that we as leaders need to be targeting, and it's not necessarily just security as an outcome. It's much more.
Absolutely agree. And just to maybe not to put too fine a point on it, and I do want to have that future session about AI, but we will have a significantly disruptive AI cyber event. We can argue what AI is. At the end of the day, it's code running on hardware, right? So cyber and AI will always be linked, and the resilience of those systems are intertwined. So think now, audience, about how your organization is going to handle that disruptive event that is rooted in some AI, and determine if you have the building blocks that allow you to pivot from traditional incident response to AI incident response.
Really, really good point. I want to start kind of putting the pieces together and kind of closing this out. The first is there are so many different things that security practitioners are trying to accomplish. For organizations with limited resources, what are some of the practical steps to scale resilience without overwhelming themselves?
Yeah, it's a really key question, Greg. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, you can start in a very simple way. So again, I would say literally listing, here are the things we do, the assets required to do them, and then drawing lines between those things. I mean, that is absolutely how we've assisted some organizations. I'd also say look for resources like those offered by CERT and by Homeland Security and Department of Energy that allow you to apply these concepts, right? There's a catalog of things that are freely available to the audience, that can really jumpstart their progression and their journey in resilience.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune of being in, since I left government service, a variety of different sized organizations. And one organization that I had the good fortune of supporting was a SaaS company, and publicly traded SaaS organization. And they asked me to come in. They had two incidents back to back. Lost confidence in their CISO, brought me in to lead the charge, and so I went through and evaluated, actually using CERT RMM, their incident response capabilities, their risk management capabilities. I did the DevSecOps examination that I did was against uh, the SAM model, but really useful examination for their board. General counsel brought me into the organization, and I did it for the board. And the recommendations that I made really started around improving the risk management practice of the organization. And about a year after the engagement, the leader that got promoted into the risk job called me, and she said, you were spot on. By being able to articulate the risk for the organization and measure that in a material way, we were able to bring all these additional resources in from a security perspective. We were able to tell the leadership team where we were at. And I think that's one of the most important fundamental components here is managing risk and operational resilience. They're intertwined, and I think really important, an important starting point for even the smallest organization to be able to start to articulate what they can achieve and what they need to grow into, and make it kind of incremental as they develop and grow. Uh, last thoughts here. What's one piece of advice you'd give organizations aiming to strengthen their resilience today?
Yeah, well, I guess it can be two pieces to this advice. One is be smart consumers of the resources that are out there. And I would, right, this is, very specifically advocating for CERT Resilience Management Model, but there are others like it, right? Use the pieces that fit for you. Don't feel you have to do everything in a given model. So the other piece of advice is start small, use fit for purpose as the design principle, and don't be afraid to revisit and reassess the value that you're yielding from these efforts.
Outstanding. And then the final question here is, where can listeners find more about CERT RMM and operational resilience best practices?
Sure. So right here on the SEI website, where I imagine folks are going to find this webcast. So there's a catalog of resources. In fact, I think we'll put that in the show notes so that they can directly link to it.
Yeah, outstanding, Matt. I am so excited to do this series with you. As you know, I'm very passionate about operational resilience, and I've lived the benefits of being involved in leveraging the model, and I just applaud what you guys are doing at Carnegie Mellon and the SCI to make this body of practice available, and really value our friendship as well, Matt.
Absolutely great. And I would say no one that I know sincerely has been more ardent an advocate for these concepts in this work than you, Greg. So thank you for being a thought leader in the space, and thanks again for agreeing to do this series with me.